So early in the Christian era, in Celtic territory, we find expressions of everything essentially being composed of sacred light.
Muir is a very good example of Celtic spirituality.
The whole of the cosmos, the whole of the earth, is like a sacred text, and it's a living text. It's not a sort of fixed, once-for-all written text. It's forever unfolding. There were still practices quite common in parts of the Celtic stream in Scotland of women, for instance, bending their knee, as it was called, bowing to the whiteness of the moon at night, or for men to take off their cap to the sun in the morning and to accompany that gesture with an utterance of prayer that was like a looking to the sun within the sun, or the moon within the moon, or the light within all light.
He grew up in a very kind of strict Victorian household in Scotland.
His Calvinist father had actually forced him to memorize scripture. And I mean, he says by the age of 11, he was able to recite the whole of the New Testament scriptures. Tension between Muir and his father on that front is a tension that we see playing out in Scotland at this time, because Calvinism is reigning supreme in terms of power and authority and structure of religion in the land. But there's this undercurrent of Celtic spirituality that was never satisfied with just reading the book of Scripture.
So he makes a joke about it, that the Scottish have discovered that there's a close connection between memory and the excitation of the flesh.
It was a very, very strict environment. He escaped every chance he could get. He would go climbing these really sheer and sort of hazardous cliffs on the coast.
His written word is inspiring, his life story is inspiring, and we need that sort of inspiration to inspire current and future generations. I'd like to welcome everybody to the John Muir Birthplace Museum. My name's Duncan Smead. I'm chairman of the John Muir Birthplace Charitable Trust that own this building and work in conjunction with other trustees to operate it. And I'm also chairman of the Friends of John Muir's Birthplace, one of the goals of which is to support the work of the Birthplace Trust and provide volunteers for this museum. One of the major exhibits here on the ground floor is about John's grandfather, David Gilry, and how he encouraged Muir's love of nature and instilled that love of nature in Muir. One day when John and his brother were doing the homework in front of the grandfather's fire, John's father came over to break the news that they were going to emigrate to America in the morning. And of course that was devastating for the grandfather. And as the story unfolds, we see here David Gilry gave each of the boys a gold sovereign as a keepsake, and John would never see his grandfather again.
We don't know a lot about David Gilry, his grandfather, but it would not be unusual for there to be a type of presence that really embodied that ancient Celtic understanding of the sacredness of nature.
And then his family moved to North America, to Wisconsin, when he was 11 years old.
He says, I could have become a millionaire, but I chose to become a tramp. He was a genius with machinery, and he developed all kinds of devices and was hired during the Industrial Revolution to increase factory production among employees.
Because curiosity, in a way, is the voice of the spirit. It's that inner voice that says, hey, go look at that, go check that out, do a little more investigation. That's, when we do that, we're investigating the divine, we're investigating God. And that's what he did.
And then after he had an accident in one factory where a file slipped and hit his eye and he was temporarily blind.
That becomes not only a sort of potentially dying moment for Muir, it is it's an experience out of which something new comes that he hadn't been anticipating, and that ends up being a critical point of transition for him.
Sure, John Muir being in the dark for several months, that's a very deep state. He was, just like doing, in effect, a personal retreat for that time.
Realized what he really wanted to do was to spend the rest of his days immersed in the natural world.
I have always felt a connection to nature. I assume that each of us does too. I first met my nature in that sacred landscape the Lakota call Paha Sa Pa, also known as the Black Hills of South Dakota, as my parents drove west to California in 1961 on their honeymoon. I was born 9 months later. As a very young child, they took me to Yosemite National Park, and there was no turning back for me. Over the years, I would revisit Yosemite many times, and I would later take my own 15-year-old son into that inspired landscape. Mystic, prophet, author, poet, conservationist, radical, John Muir. John Muir, sometimes known as John of the Mountains, found his muse and spiritual inspiration in the range of light. John Muir's baptism in Yosemite's waterfalls and storms has inspired generations to their own spiritual baptism into nature, including me.
There was a giant windstorm, and instead of hunkering down, he actually climbed to the top of a pine tree.
And tying himself up on that swaying.
And just clung to the top of the pine tree while it was whipping around.
And swaying back and forth.
For him, it seemed like a dance that the trees were doing with the storm.
Other trees were crashing all around him.
This was living, and this was experiencing this tree and this storm and really knowing.
Ability to bend with nature and move with nature rather than try to resist it.
When he climbed the tree, he became an extension of that which was rooted to the earth and bound to the earth that was living. So he was a living extension of something that was already alive and bound to the earth with his head in the clouds.